Hi, welcome to the Crates Motel. My name's Conan. In today's video, we're going to look at the often misunderstood air maximizer in the MPC and look at how to use it and when to use it. So a very basic explanation. A limiter is a form of extreme compression. So if you were to take a compressor and set it to 10.1 ratio or higher, you're entering limit zone. A limiter will prevent peaks from clipping, and then you add the volume. It simply knocks down the loudest peaks but leaves the lower material untouched. A maximizer kind of does the same thing, but it's back to front. So it will increase the level of the lower and higher part of the material, and then you'll set the ceiling to prevent clipping. So what is the actual difference if they do the same thing? For me personally, as a mastering engineer, it's not about the differences, it's about when I would choose to use a maximizer or when I would choose to use a limiter. You know, and this obviously comes from experience and trial and error, but the better that you know your tools, the more times you put yourself in a situation and you have to try these different tools, then the better you're going to be to assess the situation and choose, do I use a maximizer or do I use a limiter? For example, if I'm dealing with a pre-master that has a lot of different RMS levels in certain sections, or there's no sub-bass into sub-bass, or very hard transients into sustained transients, then I'd probably reach for a maximizer first. The reason is it brings up the quieter parts theoretically and evens things out nicely without sounding too crushed. If I was to reach for a limiter in that situation, by the time I've increased the level of the lower parts of the material, the higher peaks are just going to be so crushed, it's just going to sound terrible. But if the source is more constant, then I probably would reach for a limiter first. But of course, the thing is, there isn't a right or wrong. You know, and nowadays it's so easy to A and B. We can have the limiter on our chain, we can have the maximizer on our chain, we can A and B between them, and we can decide through assessment which we think is the best tool for the job. So I have a track in the MPC which I want to maximise the loudness of, and I'm going to A and B between a limiter and a maximizer and decide which I think would be the best to use, and obviously explain how the maximizer works as well. So let's have a quick blast. So as you can see here, the maximizer has very similar controls to the limiter. You have a ceiling, a look ahead, a release, and you have the low frequency mono as well. In the maximizer, you have a threshold, ceiling, look ahead, and you have a knee, which will be hard and soft, I'll explain that. And you have your release here, and you also have the low frequency mono here as well. Now, as I explained, with the maximizer, you're increasing the lower levels and the higher levels of the signal. Rather than with a limiter, you're just limiting the peaks and then adding gain. So if you're familiar with the OTT plugin or the Oxford inflator, I think that's kind of what Akai were trying to do here. Now, me personally, I was going through this earlier on, listening to the track and applying the maximizer to it. To me, it sounds like there's possibly some saturation going on, and saturation is a really, really good way to increase perceived loudness without actually increasing the levels as such. So it makes things sound louder without being louder, if that makes sense. So I think that's probably what's going on here. So it gives you the impression, I mean, if you know very much about the Oxford inflator, it's a kind of bit of a legendary plugin. No one really knows exactly what's going on in it, but it's somehow, in some way or form, some voodoo stuff, it kind of increases things in such a nice balanced way, but brings up the low parts and the high parts equally, and kind of blends them out nicely. And I guess that's what the maximizer is doing here. It's a bit difficult to explain. I've tried to explain the Oxford inflator to people before, and it's like explaining the offside rule in soccer. So let's have a listen with a maximizer. Now, generally in a situation like this, I probably would stick with a hard knee. Just purely, I mean, I'll show you what the soft knee does, but with a hard knee, because I'm going for maximum loudness, it's just, you're going to get it more with a hard knee rather than a soft knee. I'll show you exactly what I mean. So we're going to bring the ceiling down to minus 0.2. That's a pretty standard level for mastering, just to give you a tiny little bit of headroom. You don't want to be pushing it up to 0. You want just a little bit of headroom. With a look ahead, I've explained this in another one of my videos about limiters. 0.5 seems to be pretty decent on the Akai. Whether it is actually 0.5 milliseconds or not, I'm not exactly sure, but I find that if I go lower than that and the signal has got a lot of low end in it, you do start getting some distortion. So anywhere between 0.5 and 1 millisecond seems to be a pretty decent level to set if you want maximum loudness and you don't want any distortion. With the low frequency, we'll take that up to about 80 Hertz. And with the release, around about 75 milliseconds I'll start off with. And we'll see how that sounds. Now be prepared for a jump in level. There's no auto gain on the MPC, as I've explained in videos before, so it's a bit difficult to really compare properly A and B because the jump in volume can sometimes fool you a little bit. So you really need to listen to how the transients react, how the low end reacts, you know, go through the different parts of the frequency. Listen to the low end, listen to the low mids, into the mids, listen to what kind of effect the maximizer is having on it, and that's really the only way you can gauge it, because otherwise there is a jump in volumes. It's quite difficult to gauge, so be prepared for that. So you can tell straight away, I can hear that the transients have been very, very slightly rounded off. I'll show you in Softly. So it's slightly more transparent in Softly, but I can still hear slight rounding off. But for this type of track, I kind of like the way that the transients are being rounded off. So for me so far, the maximizer sounds good. And at this point, I haven't really increased the lower parts of the signal. So now you're starting to see where the peaks are being clipped and the volume is being pushed up. But it's also bringing up the lower parts of material in a sort of upward compressor type sort of way. So it's inflating things, maximizing the volume. And because this track has got quite a dynamic range, to bring it kind of into balance, it's nicer using a maximizer because I'm increasing the lower parts and bringing down the higher parts. So I'm reducing the dynamic range as such. But it still sounds quite balanced. I'll show you with a limiter in a moment. With a track like this, it's not going to work quite as well. Good way to gauge this, actually, gauge what the effect is doing, is listen to the tail of the snare drums. Without the maximizer turned on, the tail drifts, sort of cuts off much quicker. But with the maximizer, because it's bringing up the lower parts of the signal a lot more, it's bringing up the tail slightly of the snare drums. So the tail sounds kind of louder. And that's where that kind of upward compression kind of thing's going on, I think. So listen to the tails on the snare drum when I turn the maximizer on and off. I know it's difficult to really gauge because of the difference in volume, but just listen, concentrate on the tails of the snare drum. So now I feel like I've balanced the sound by using the threshold, the release, the look ahead. For me now, the A and B difference doesn't sound as drastic. There isn't as much of that kind of noticeable effect. So you have to play around with the controls. With the maximizer, you have to be very, very subtle. You can't push things. It breaks up very, very quickly. And I've actually heard other people say this in videos that, you know, they'll complain. They'll say the maximizer doesn't sound any good. My signal sounds terrible straight away. Incidentally, the default setting when you first turn this on, I have my own user default setting, but for some reason Akai have set the threshold at -20, so it sounds awful as soon as you switch maximizer on. So bear that in mind. I don't know why Akai have done that, to be honest, because, you know, normally with the initial default on a plugin, you want the plugin to sound as good as it possibly can so that people think, oh, well, yeah, I like this plugin, and start playing around with it. But if you switch a plugin on straight away and it sounds terrible, and you don't really understand the plugin, you're going to step away from it. You're not going to use it. And from the videos that I've seen and from comments I've seen on forums about the maximizer, I think because it's a little bit misunderstood, and because it can break up very, very quickly, and you have to be very, very subtle with the threshold, the look ahead, and the release times, it's difficult to get a decent sound out of it. But if you prevail, if you really learn how to use the controls on it properly, you can get a really, really nicely balanced maximum loudness out of your track. But you just have to, you know, you have to feel it, and you have to realize that there's no default. You have to realize that there's not going to be a preset that I could tell you or anyone else could tell you that you could apply to every single track, or, you know, every single drum kit or every single bass or whatever you're using the maximizer on, that's just going to work, because it doesn't work like that, I'm afraid. There isn't a golden bullet, you know, there isn't one default preset that's going to work. So you really have to kind of feel your way with this, and it is a little bit more difficult to get right than the limiter. So just have a quick another listen to that with the maximizer. I know again the volumes jump, but if you listen, I've tried to get them to sound not so crushed, so there isn't such a difference when applying the maximizer, but it is bringing up the levels of the lower part of the signal a lot more and giving it a nice balanced perceived loudness. So now if you listen to the snare tails, they're not doing what was happening earlier on when I had the threshold lower and I was hitting it a lot harder. So I'm going to do a similar setting with the limiter and a similar amount of gain reduction. So let's just set that to around about 80. Let's take the look ahead to about 5. Let's take the release down to about 75 to start with. The reason why I'm going for 75, by the way, is just from my experience. This track is about 115 BPM. I know that the release on a limiter around about 75 milliseconds for that kind of tempo from about 110 to 130 is a pretty good ballpark figure to start with. But don't look at 75 milliseconds and think that's the release that I should always use on limiters and maximizers, because it isn't. You know, you have to play around, like I explained, to get the best feeling from the track. So we'll bring the ceiling down to -0.2. Just want to make sure that yes, it is. Want to make sure the maximizer is turned off. So we're getting a similar gain reduction here in the limiter. So I think I've got them fairly close there, where they're about the same level in terms of perceived loudness. If you listen to what the maximizer is doing to the overall signal, it's making it sound more balanced and more louder throughout equally. And with the limiter, it sounds a little bit more pumpier to me. Now, if I was to push the limiter very slightly even more, it would start breaking up, because I heard that just a second ago. So, you know, for me in this situation, this style of track, the maximizer works better for me from a mastering point of view to get the maximum loudness out of it. I'll just flick between the both of them again and listen to how the limiter doesn't make it sound as loud as evenly as the maximizer does throughout the entire frequency range. Now, which you think is best there is entirely subjective. I like both. I like the effect of both of them, to be honest. I kind of do like the way that the limiter is making things breathe a little bit, but I do like the way that the maximizer has made the dynamic range sound more even in terms of the quieter parts of the signal. It's reduced the dynamic range in a nice balanced way, whereas the limiter, the dynamic range has been reduced and it sounds a little bit crushed to me, and it's a little bit pumpy, which is something you really don't want out of a limiter. You don't want it to sound pumpy, because you're starting to affect the dynamics of the song too much. So for me personally, you may think completely differently. For me, I prefer the way the maximizer is increasing the loudness of the track. So there you have it, the Air Maximizer. So which is better, limiter or maximizer? Something that I always say to my students, and they're probably bored of hearing it, is there is no better, there is only better for you. And what I mean by that is what is what's best for that situation, and it's not always going to be the same answer. And the fact that we have a choice is amazing. A more advanced technique would be to stack the maximizer and the limiter. In that way, both processes will be doing slightly less work. So you'll get more loudness, but you'll be less likely to get any distortion. So we'd use the maximizer to bring up the loudness of the lower and the higher elements of the track, and then you would use the limiter to catch the peaks. And in that way, both of them would be doing less work, and you can get more loudness, and it sounds more natural, and it doesn't crush the dynamic range just quite as much. Another thing that you could do, for me, especially with the maximizer and the MPC, I feel that it colours the sound slightly. So I would use the maximizer first. I'd use an EQ afterwards, possibly the Air EQ, the Air Power EQ, and I would balance out the sound slightly. It sounds like it's bringing the high mids and the highs up very, very slightly. So I'd use the EQ just to balance the sound a little bit throughout. And then I would have the limiter after that and drive into the limiter for absolute maximum loudness. But that way, again, both the maximizer and the limiter are doing less work, but combined together, you're going to get a lot more perceived loudness. But, you know, of course, the options are limitless, excuse the pun, if you open your mind and experiment. So thanks for watching. Please subscribe for more mixing, mastering and MPC tutorials and reviews. This is the Crates Motel. My name's Conan. Till next time.